Concluding The Naked Civil Servant by Quentin Crisp. Chapter 27. Into the coach there sometimes came a young woman whom I knew well, but only from having seen her so often in the neighboring cafes. During a silence that must have been caused by my having to pause for breath, she said, "Why don't you come and talk to our lot?" Something about this question, and in particular about the words "our lot," warned me that she might be a social worker. I instinctively recoiled, though no opportunity to speak uninterrupted could be allowed to pass without investigation. I began to question her. "They're raving," I said, and she agreed. It transpired that she spent much of her spare time organizing entertainment for the patients of a day hospital for mental cases. I told her that I would talk to anyone who couldn't get away, but that I never spoke for long about anything but myself. "Well, that wouldn't do," she said. "It would be therapeutic." I thought this objection closed the subject. A few days later she informed me that she had spoken to the doctors with whom she worked, and that they had given permission for me to tell all. So one Sunday afternoon, weighed down with notes, I went to her hospital and spoke, and spoke, and spoke. The snags that I had feared did not crop up. I did not lose my voice, and as we were all sitting cozily in a recreation room, and not, as I had feared, in a vast lecture hall, I think I am right in supposing that I could be heard. I found that even giving a talk has its own technique, and that I was reading my notes instead of addressing my audience. However, the doctor in charge was polite enough to appear satisfied. He was chiefly glad that what I had said had provoked my hearers to question me and to converse with one another. The conversation that followed my talk was sad. It was all in psychological terminology. Even patients who had difficulty in arranging their thought in any kind of order at all knew all the long words, all the delusive alibis. This was what always seemed to me wrong with psychology. It did not stop at ridding the misfit of his feeling of shame. It went further and gave him a vocabulary with which to glorify himself. Why should anyone bother whether he steals or not, whence he need not say, "I'm dishonest," but can claim to be a kleptomaniac? The final nail was hammered into the coffin of psychology when a friend of mine, whose tears had trickled down to his toes for several weeks, sought the aid of a psychiatrist. He explained his problem, and was told that it was nonsense to assert that one man could fall in love with another. All that was needed to set matters right was for my friend to find some nice girl and flop into bed with her. I was interested to know whether this advice was accepted. Me. "Whatever did you do, then?" My friend. "I rang up Mrs. X, and she said, 'Very well, dear.'" Me. "And are you redeemed?" My friend. "It's the same." Me. "Well, well, then everything's all right now?" My friend, his tears beginning to flow afresh. "It's not. It's more confusing than ever." A fortnight after my visit to the hospital, I too went to see a psychologist. He had gone to the same institution the following week and been told about my visit. I was surprised that his first question was, "Is there anything you would like to ask me?" He was obviously equally bewildered when I said there was not. The interview was very short. He told me that he was preparing yet another survey of homosexuals, and indeed of all the minorities he could think of. 20 years earlier I would have thought this such a noble undertaking. Now I tried not to sigh. As I rose to leave him, the psychologist said, in a faintly irritable tone, "I think it's a pity you dress the way you do, but still, I was taken aback by this remark. We seemed to be reading once again that paragraph which used to occur in all books about sexual abnormality, and which began, "There's no need to waste time considering that small group of men who dress and act in an effeminate manner." Men whose bedroom habits differ markedly from those of their friends have troubles. They touch a spot where no survey can reach. But if these same people feel no compulsion to wear the clothes of the opposite sex, or to teeter awkwardly among the vanishing demarcation line between men and women, they have no minority problem whatsoever. In a time outworn, when God was alive and words like decency and purity were used seriously, people objected, on moral grounds, to associating with men they even suspected of being queer. Now that morality is finished, and social convenience is the only criterion of behavior, it is only obviously effeminate men who are ostracized. It is universally agreed that men are neither heterosexual nor homosexual, they are just sexual. Of my visit to the day hospital for the insane, the ballet teacher asked for what possible purpose it had been arranged. Before I was able to reply, another friend began to say, "Well, Quentin has a problem of adjusting himself to society, and he—" This sentence was never finished. The ballet teacher expostulated, "I don't agree. Quentin does exactly as he pleases. The rest of us have to adapt ourselves to him." This remark seemed to me to outline a great dilemma. Almost all the psychological ills that a man can suffer spring from self-doubt. Once this is removed, his troubles vanish. But if anyone really came to believe that he was wise, witty, kind, and beautiful, think what troubles his friends would have. A friend of mine used to come, weighed down with tales of stony-hearted landladies, to the office of the display firm, where my boss, temporarily abandoning her rule, fed him with cocoa and allowed him to sleep in her flat on coverlets of leopardette. This was touching, but it was obviously not a permanent solution to his plight. I telephoned a hooligan and his wife, who ruled a boarding house in the north of London. They took him in. Thus it became possible to visit my friend and his landlords for the price of one bus fare. Feeling that this was a bargain, I took to going to Crouch End quite often. One summer's day we were all sitting in a heap in a garden full of broken bicycles and ruined sink baths. My hostess's two children clambered all over her as though she were a playground fixture. Suddenly she declared she couldn't go on living in this way much longer. I had told her, even when she was pregnant, that she had taken the veil for at least 17 years with no time off for good conduct. I was distressed to hear her already complaining. Her oldest child was barely 3. I asked if she could think of any possible escape route. She said that she needed a huge sum of money. When I questioned her as to how she hoped to come by this, she pointed to a paragraph in one of the culture papers which announced a television play contest. Once again, and once again fruitlessly as it turned out, I roused myself. I jumped up and down, swung on the trees, stood on upturned sink baths, and declaimed in an all-out effort to bring to life before her very eyes a science fiction musical. "Take me, make me your flying sorceress," with which I told her that she could easily win any competition. Hitching up her sunsuit, she rushed indoors and typed a letter to the paper in question to ask for a list of rules for the contest. When I next visited her, she had received a reply from Granada Television informing her that 3 plays were required. I ran all the way home and searched under the bed where no human eye had looked for 18 years, and there found 2 plays, dusty in more senses than one. All the inmates of the Crouch End house were compromised into condensing retyping, and generally warming up these unappetizing leftovers, while I searched Soho for a South American guitarist who would write some science fiction music. The entire combined efforts of all these geniuses were a total loss, even though the scripts were accompanied by a covering letter which said, "Granada shall live again." Just as I was sinking uncomfortably back into oblivion, I received a telephone message from the guitarist saying that he had begun yet another musical. I was on the brink of crying, "Oh no!" when I realized that I could not fairly do this. If he had so generously written the music for my words, I must now write the words for his music. He explained to me that he wanted a simple boy meets girl story with lyrics. This I felt was quite beyond my capabilities. I did not know any boys who met girls. I persuaded him to settle for a horror musical. Every little monster wantster. This play was great fun to write, and my association with the composer was without disagreements of any kind. He didn't understand the jokes, and I didn't understand the music. I never understood music. It all seemed to me to be the maximum amount of noise conveying the minimum amount of information. I think of these failures as happy disasters. Unlike the writing of my novel, which took me away from people and used up time in which I could have been speaking, the plays contained built-in success of a small kind. I was able continually to show off before my collaborator. Indeed, a large part of our time was spent jumping up and down and exclaiming at each other's greatness. Also, failure no longer depressed me deeply. Each unsuccessful attempt to win fame brought me nearer to the time when triumph would be useless, even if it came. I had gradually become more or less immune to feeling of every kind, and to disappointment in particular. I had been hit in the same place too often. I also had by now learned that the way to deal with unpleasant events was to tell everyone about them. Words had become a salve with which to heal the wounds inflicted on me by experience. When the war ended, and it dawned on me that never again was I likely to play a leading role in the streets of London, I started to live a rich, full life by proxy. I took to the movies. This was an admission of weakness, dearer but less embarrassing than evening classes. All culture, even popular forms of it, was, in my eyes, a sin. To point out that works of art were beautiful did not justify their creators. Pearls were beautiful, but only diseased oysters had them. The enjoyment of works of art seemed to me even more damnable than the fabrication of them, since there could be never any money in it. Moreover, to read a novel or see a play was to drink life through a straw, to smoke it up through a filter tip. If we were not afraid of blackening our teeth or riddling our lungs with cancer, if we were a dauntless race of men with strong digestions, we would be able to devour life without the aid of these over-civilized devices. To minimize my guilt in going to the pictures, to call this wanton pursuit of an effete pleasure by another name, I needed movie companions as drunkards need drinking companions. If I entered a cinema alone, God might plunge his arm through the roof of the auditorium, booming in a stereophonic voice, "And you, Crisp, what are you doing here?" I would never have dared to reply, "I'm just enjoying myself, Lord." I remembered too well what happened to Mr. and Mrs. Adam. A commissionaire with a flaming sword came and asked them to leave. If, however, I could gesticulate toward a friend and shrug my shoulders, I might be thought to have performed an act of self-sacrifice. This would at least divide my shame by two. The trouble was that good moviegoers were hard to come by, even though I was willing to pay. I had just started to feel the pull of the expanding universe. The life that starts in the heart of London gradually drifts outward. As my friends became older, many of them married and moved out of Soho into the suburbs, where their failure would be less apparent. If their unions were cursed and children were born to them, they went even farther. By the time I was 45, I found that almost all my older friends had gone, if not like Henry Vaughan's, into a world of light, at least on to the North Circular Road. I had to nag strangers into coming to the cinema with me. This was hard work, for the strangers who were willing to talk to me in cafes were hooligans, and hooligans do not like entertainment. They will walk and they will drink. In their weaker moments they will even eat, but they will not go to a theater, or read a book, or see a film. Even so, I managed to go to the pictures, and never alone, on an average of once a week for many years. Sometimes I went 3 times in 3 consecutive days, and, very occasionally, twice in one day, thus spending 7 hours out of 24 in the forgetting chamber. Real life became for me like a series of those jarring moments when the screen goes blinding white. The jagged edge of a torn strip of film flicks one's eyeballs, and there is a flash of incomprehensible numerals lying on their sides, like a message in code from Hades, before the dream begins again. I gladly saw almost any film, unless it was English. My taste in movies had changed very little since the far-off days when, in The Black Cat, I and my friends had acted out to each other the stories of the various pictures we had seen. I was still a devotee of the divine woman. In my lifetime, she changed her name 3 times, calling herself first Brigitte Helm, later Greta Garbo, and finally Marlene Dietrich. I thought about her a great deal, wore her clothes, said her sphinx-like lines, and ruled her kingdom. I came to the conclusion that beauty was not a girl, but an Aryan face seen through Semitic eyes. This was what gave her that tragic and remote quality. If what the wandering Jew, who might not by now have changed his name to Fritz Lang, most longed for was unbearable pleasure indefinitely prolonged, then he had to invent for himself a woman who was both beautiful and unattainable. We have come a long, degrading way from Miss Helm to Mademoiselle Bardot. The fault lies not in our movie stars, but in ourselves. Those beauties of the last generation symbolized hopeless love. Now it is too late for tears. What modern young man has the time to play a guitar under his true love's window, or the energy to climb up the ivy into her room? In bed he is embracing the bomb. Someone had to invent espresso sex, and to serve each cup of this tasteless beverage there had to be a mechanical doll whose only recommendation was her infinite availability. The woman who came to embody this ideal to the full was Marilyn Monroe. Her directors persuaded her to flaunt her astonishing sexual equipment before us with the touching defenselessness of a retarded child. She was what the modern young man most desires in life, a mistress who could be won without being wooed. She was the football pool of love. This was no kind of diet for anyone brought up on Rider Haggard. Nevertheless, I continued to linger in the 1 and 9 pennies, on the principle that any film is at least better than real life. In the absence of stars, I began to concentrate on the stories. I became disturbed by their curious morality. It seemed that, to scriptwriters, sex was sacred and money was damned. Over and over again I saw heroines forgiven, even praised, for the most dubious behavior, if they could claim that their object had been sexual fulfillment. To me this seemed not merely a flimsy excuse, but a circumstance that only increased the crime. My views on this subject were expressed once and for all by a char hired by a friend of mine. She was unaware that she had begun to live in a street of shame. The cleaner knew not only what sins were committed, but who was committing them, and her comments were an education to my friend. The most enlightening day of all was when the char dragged her by the sleeve to the front window, and said of a figure disappearing around the corner of the street, "Quick, madam, look at that one. Girls that do it for money are bad enough, but she does it to oblige." This was a moral standpoint that no filmmaker would ever have understood. When movie ethics became too confusing for me, I ceased to bother about them and turned my attention to the technique of film construction. Before long, even this interest was snatched from me by the modern passion for the haphazard, for the abandonment of style. When Antonioni ascended the celluloid throne, pictures became as boring as being alive. After almost 20 years in the twilight zone, I came blinking back into the light of day. Chapter 28. I would never have embarked even upon such a cozy disaster as writing a horror musical, if the opportunity had not presented itself when I had nothing profitable to do. I left the display job in November, and there was just time to write Carry On Hearse, or The Thing and I, before the start of what the schools mockingly call spring term. I was going back to posing, not because I still preferred it to all other ways of earning a living, but because there was nothing else for me to do. Only 4 years had gone by since I had last been a full-time model, but I was shocked to find how much worse the situation had become. During the war, things had been somewhat haphazard. Now students enrolled for chaos. Work had almost ceased. The young people wandered through the corridors in droves, shouting, cursing, singing, necking. The amount of life drawing available to them had increased, but their interest in it dwindled and had in some cases vanished altogether. Although these young people took almost no notice whatsoever of what went on in the outer world, they did go to the galleries, and in them they no longer saw any paintings of naked girls flopping about on piles of cushions. No nudes was good news. This change in aesthetic fashion meant that they could produce a large number of pictures with very little study. The sudden arrival of a model in the life room signified a temporary return to a pursuit that was old-fashioned, unprofitable, and difficult. One art school in Kent was, I felt, a kind of cultural borstal. While working there, out of the corner of my eye, I perceived two students lying one on top of the other on a long wooden box which had been pushed into a corner of the light room. The art master saw the look of horror that o'erspread my withered features, and followed the line of my gaze to its cause. Standing over the entangled couple, he waited, thinking that the very proximity of so much contempt would chill their ardor. This proved a vain hope. He was compelled to stoop, and plunging his hand into the matted hair of the girl, to pry her face from that of her lover. There was a sound like tearing sticking plaster from a painful wound. I thought the young man would say, "The woman you gavest me tempted me," but no. From eyes dull with debauchery, sunk in faces glistening with saliva, the two pupils gave their teacher a sullen stare. Then very slowly they got up and returned to their easels. If being treated with indifference was now the daily lot of most models, it was obvious that open contempt would be shown to me. I was a natural target, and my heroic postures on the throne now seemed more ludicrous than ever. In some schools the mounting hostility led to insults about my appearance and my private life being hurled at me by students sitting on the window ledges to watch me arrive and depart. I found it depressing that this kind of behavior should still prevail. On so many levels, the age of tolerance was in full bloom. The utopia dreamed of by me and the friends of my youth was here. Anyone could do or say or wear anything without being arrested, almost without public disapproval. This applied particularly to men's wear, about which, when I was young, everyone had been so sensitive. A factor no one had foreseen had come to the aid of the party. The population of England now contained more men than women. Therefore, masculine plumage had become more colorful. Also, Mr. Bronowski's arrow of time, which he assures us always points in the direction of diminishing difference, had struck at the heart of our civilization. The distinction between the sexes was reduced to the point where it would have been difficult to tell the boys from the girls if the clothes of the young men had not become so sexually revealing. Indeed, their trousers could go no further, or, should it be, no nearer, unless they adopted a Plantagenet style, wore tights, and carried their pride and joy in a specially tailored sack tied with two smart bows. All these strange manifestations do not prove that more copulation is going on in the world than formerly, but that sex as an idea, as a topic of conversation, is enjoying a freedom never before known, and what can be spoken of soon becomes to be condoned. If you asked the man in the modern street for his opinion of homosexuality, he would probably reply, "I've got nothing against queers myself, but I wouldn't like one of them to marry my father." In Neuilly-sur-Seine there is an apartment house in the hall of which this notice is pinned up. In this establishment window boxes are strictly forbidden. Will each tenant therefore make sure that his are firmly fixed to the window sills. It is odd that this admonition should have been issued in France. It seems to typify a particularly English mode of thought, and one that currently applies to the national attitude toward homosexuality. The law remained the same as it was before Bridget Brophy was born, but public opinion had moved on. This window box morality was offensive to legalists and logicians, but to homosexuals it was easily acceptable. As a member of the Law Reform Society said, in tones trembling with reproach, "It's you, the people concerned, that are so hopelessly indifferent." This is true. The fundamental predicament of homosexuals is one that no amount of legislation can improve. Even the argument that the repeal of the laws against private indecency will lessen opportunities for blackmail is founded on a misunderstanding. No one in his right senses will attempt to blackmail anyone to the police. The realization of the threat would merely lead to both parties being clapped in a dungeon. Blackmail operates by the threat to reveal facts of which a man is ashamed to those whose good opinion he prizes. This is hardly ever likely to be the CID. It may easily be the victim's mother or wife or employer. To rob blackmail of its potency, it would be necessary to remove the homosexual's feeling of shame. This no power on earth can do. From this feeling of inadequacy and exile, I was not immune. The only difference between me and other outsiders was that I cried aloud for pardon. Almost every living being seems to feel that if all were known, he would be admired, and even I was never able to rid myself of the idea that if all were known, I would be forgiven. At least a step in this direction was taken when it was at last understood that human beings respond to almost any erotic stimulus. It was only while people still felt that God was watching them that they directed their impulses exclusively toward certain parts of certain people. In everybody, the anus is at least capable of sexual excitement as the lips. Sex acts are now termed masculine and others feminine, only to keep the subject tidy. In my own life a mystery still lingers. It seems that, as a child, I was particularly susceptible to anal stimulus, and that my repeated accidents were the result of my unwillingness to forego a pleasure of retaining my feces until it was too late. It would be unreasonable to think that at that age I deliberately adopted an effeminate exterior in the hope that this would one day introduce me to other ways of obtaining the same satisfaction. On the other hand, it is difficult not to presume some connection. All the intimate subjects which were now being discussed so loudly in such public places had been known on higher levels for a long time, but the knowledge had only recently seeped down to places where it made a difference to the general attitude toward kinkiness. As Brophy's first law says, it is not the simple statement of facts that ushers in freedom, it is the constant repetition of them that has this liberating effect. Tolerance is the result not of enlightenment, but of boredom. The sad truth remains, however, that adolescents must have something to scorn at least as much as they feel themselves to be scorned. Queer baiting has not vanished. It has fallen into the hands of younger and younger boys. Quite recently I was asked for money, and, when I feigned not to have heard, was kicked in the groin and threatened with worse by 6 children young enough to demand half fares when they scrambled onto the bus that I had boarded to escape them. This incident was not a boyish prank. The leaders of the gang knew all the wounding words and were sufficiently worldly to threaten to tell the police that I had tampered with them in Trafalgar Square. If all the praise that I had ever received seemed no more than my due, it follows that all the rough treatment that I underwent appeared undeserved. Only by a great effort at detachment could I see that to other people my appearance, which had once provoked them to indignation because it represented sin, now aggravated them because it had become the over-emphatic statement of a tired axiom. To the younger generation, to whom the words good and evil, innocence and guilt, have lost all meaning, it was no longer any wickedness that annoyed them. It was my pomposity, my insistence on taking the blame for something on which judgment was no longer passed. Also, by an unlucky chance, the symbols which I had adopted 40 years earlier to express my sexual type had become the uniform of all young people. By wearing bright colors and growing my hair long, I had, by mistake, become the oldest teenager in the business. It was irritating for the men to see me converting their attire to my own ends. I inadvertently gave the impression of trying to gate-crash a King's Road party for people 2 generations younger than I. I was not merely a stopped clock. I was a stopped grandfather clock. Before this criticism I was defenseless. It was much too late for me to rejoin the human race I had left in childhood. I would have had no idea how to go on in the presence of real people as their equal. If I had originally been a member of their club, I had certainly never paid my dues, and, as Macbeth would have said, I was in tinsel steeped, in so far that, should I wade no more, returning were as tedious as go o'er. Chapter 29. For the first 3 years after I returned to posing, I did not take any of the drawbacks involved very seriously. I expected them, indeed the whole world, to end at any moment. When the war threw me over, I took up with the atom bomb. We were to be married in the spring of 1963. Take heart, I said to myself. All may yet be lost. Time magazine, which cannot be contradicted except by its own subsequent issues, promised that something called the Missile Gap would then be at its widest. They said that when this happened, the enemy would strike. They and I were unduly optimistic. That was years ago. If the bomb comes now, it will be too late. I shall embrace radioactivity only in the resigned spirit in which Letitia agreed to marry the egoist, partly to round off the story and partly to save the bomb's good name. Recently, I have inclined toward the view that there should not be this undignified element of hazard about the date of a person's demise. There ought to be a ministry of death, though in Orwellian terminology it would be named the Ministry of Heaven. This august body of men, all preferably under 30 years of age, would deal with the chore of exterminating old people. Before everything else, they would have to agree upon a time limit, say 60, to live beyond which would be an offense, punishable with life. Then the ministry would have to make sure that, 6 months before his 60th birthday, every living being received a notice offering post-dated congratulations and advising him which town hall he would be required to visit on the happy occasion. A week before his birthday, he would receive a final notice, and then, at the glorious hour, unless he preferred to walk there on his own 2 feet, the van would call to take him to oblivion. In America, this vehicle would be painted to look like a fiery chariot, but in England it would be plain blue, with the words Ministry of Death Kensington Branch discreetly lettered on its side. For the first few years after such a law was passed, there might occasionally be undignified scenes, but in Britain individual liberty is so often curtailed for the common good. Order would soon prevail. Everyone would come to see that the idea was basically good. It would eliminate the dreary effort put by most middle-aged people into trying to set up circumstances conducive to a tolerable old age, which in many cases never comes. Above all, the creation of this new government body would end the racially suicidal practice of limiting the number of young people in the world by the use of contraceptives. It would substitute a decrease in the heaps of old men and women cluttering up the planet. To this law there would be no exception on grounds of lack of hardship and no extensions of time. But some people might wish to avail themselves of the ministry's services at an earlier date than prescribed. They would be allowed to make 2 applications, separated in time by an interval of at least 6 months, so that the authorities might review their financial status and make sure that public facilities were not being used for the purpose of avoiding payment of private debts. This would also permit applicants to change their minds if their first application had been made in a fine, careless anguish. Like any other new political measure, the laws of death would come trailing crowds of snoopers, fixers, and black marketeers, peddling contraband old age at exorbitant prices. If food rationing worked in spite of the inhuman element, so would the controlled apportioning of days. If the government does not soon adopt some such plan as I have outlined, I shall have to put into action a more personal scheme for limiting my span of years. I shall commit a murder. This is something that for a long time I have wanted to do. It is a natural extension of the desire to hit strangers in the street or to answer them back. It would have been impossible to get through the kind of life that I have known without accumulating a vast unused stockpile of rage. Retaliation, though, was a luxury I could never afford. On the physical level, I was too feeble. On any other, I was not rich enough. I never dared be rude to anyone. I never knew that I might not need him later. Long after fantasies of sexual excess had ceased to torment me, my imagination was inflamed by lurid daydreams of having my revenge on the world. Whenever people read in the papers that someone has purchased a machine gun and mowed down a whole neighborhood, they invariably say, "I wonder what brought that on." They even make some such remark when the subject is an American Negro. To me, the motive is self-evident. Mass murderers are simply people who have had enough. Wishing to go out in a blaze of ignominy, I shall limit my activities to killing a policeman. If I am not arrested for the first murder, I shall try a second. It will be like a game of musical chairs. In the meantime, I continued to pose in the art schools, chiefly in the recreational classes. As I sank into old age, I was more often given portrait sittings. This was not because my face had crumbled any less than my figure. It was in an even worse state of repair. My teeth became such that my dentist said, "It's not your teeth that are decaying, it's you." As my character coarsened, my features thickened. On the other hand, my hair thinned. A receding hairline can be thought to add to the face an undeserved look of nobility. But when you are noble all the way to the crown of your head, you're in trouble. However, certain Slade-type students can paint a tragic greatness into eyes that hang like an impending avalanche over the cheekbones. Nothing for which the life beautiful has a name can be read into a pot-belly. Professionally, it is considered a come-down to work in portrait classes, but at least head sittings were less exacting than other kinds. I did them with what grace and gratitude I could. My lust for martyrdom had vanished long ago. I had never been legally married to real life. Between the ages of 22 and 40, I had merely conducted an uneasy and illicit liaison with it. In taking up modeling once more, it transpired that I had gone home to mother culture once too often. I made a desperate effort to get another full-time job, but now not only my odd appearance, but also my age were against me. All doors were shut. I fell back into the oubliette of art. In its Havisham twilight, I was grimly at home. About me there was something out of the dusty elaboration of her mouse-nibbled wedding cake. So here, propped up on some rickety Victorian chair, I sat silent and, I hope, apparently resigned, an ashy clinker from the long-dead fires of Bohemia. Ironically, long after the shouting and the tumult had died, a feature writer from the London office of the Scotsman telephoned. He suggested that he should write an article about me. I agreed, and a very urbane gentleman with no kilt and no accent came to question me. "They've got the idea that you're the most famous model in the world up there," he said. Me. "In heaven?" Scotsman. "No, in Edinburgh." Me. "Pity." Scotsman. "Is there any justification for this opinion?" Sadly, I explained that, as far as I knew, that conditions in which anyone could be a famous model had vanished long ago. Those few of us who were still in the racket had dwindled into naked civil servants. What happened? What went wrong? This is the question that, from a throat parched by brick dust, I ask the rescue party, as they lean for a moment's rest on their reform bills and their acts of parliament. When they see me tottering towards them, they find it difficult not to recoil. I am the survivor they hoped they would not find, something too broken to be restored to active life, but not quite ready for decent burial. My lips still move. I have learned, though I never mastered it, the modern manner. I know that on no account must I point a moral or trace a pattern through my past. I clearly see that my life was only an imprudent dash between the cradle and the tomb across open country and under fire. Yet I find it hard to take a prolonged look back and not attempt to excuse results by rearranging causes. Though intelligence is powerless to modify character, it is a dab hand at finding euphemisms for its weaknesses. D.H. Lawrence said that it was not living life that mattered, but watching it being lived. I would say that it was not watching life that mattered, but explaining what you saw. Some years ago, in a New York house, the windows of which were never opened, two brothers lived. One of them became blind and partially paralyzed. Toward the end of his life, he never went out at all. The other left the house briefly to buy food and newspapers, with which, after a while, the rooms were piled so high that the place was transformed into a network of canyons from one strategic point to another. To keep out intruders, every inch of this labyrinth was mined with booby traps. One day, one of these was set off by accident. When, months later, the corpses of the brothers were found, one of them was still sitting up in bed waiting for the other. The second lay only a few yards away, pinned by tons of newsprint to the floor. Even before he was quite dead, the rats had begun to gnaw at his body. In a sense, this was the way I lived, this the fate that overtook me. The place where no harm can come is the place where nothing at all can come. Here I stood. By constituting myself the one among the many, I had provoked the worst behavior in others. With this I felt compelled to deal politely. This wrought no change whatever in the character of my enemies, but caused the total disintegration of my own. In the end, the habit of taking no notice diminished my perception to the point where I became impervious to influence of any kind, and therefore to all change except decay. I grew boring to my friends, and, which was worse, to myself. I wanted nothing except to get into my coffin without getting into debt. But when I ask myself what went wrong, what do I feel that I missed? Love? No one has ever been in love with me, even faintly, even for half an hour. Or if they have, it was a well-kept secret. Yet I can write this sentence with nothing more than a feeling of wounded vanity. I experience no keen sense of loss because I myself was never in love with anyone, and do not clearly know what the expression means. Fame? If fame is merely to be known by a large number of people whom one does not oneself know, then I was famous, or at least notorious, for many years. The most that I can say is that some byproducts of this state of affairs were amusing. Power was what I craved most ravenously, though not because I felt I merited it. If I had had what I deserved in life, I would have starved long ago. I wanted dominion over others in order to redress the balance. A lifetime of being constantly at the mercy of others left me, even though mercy was undoubtedly shown, crushed and seething with a lust for tyranny. No one forced me into the role of a victim. Indeed, many of my friends tried to lead me out of it, but the wall-to-wall Puritanism of my early years made me excruciatingly conscious of the sin of homosexuality. I had no alternative use for my passion for showy extremes, but to make with it a Carnaby Street hair shirt. All this, at the last, I dimly saw, but an autobiography is an obituary in serial form, with the last installment missing. We think we write definitively of those parts of our nature that are dead and therefore beyond change. But that which writes is still changing, still in doubt. Even a monotonously undeviating path of self-examination does not necessarily lead to a mountain of self-knowledge. I stumble toward my grave, confused and hurt and hungry. That's the end. My recording is dedicated to my friend Deborah Rose, who, among many things, got me back reading Quentin Crisp. I found him in the library because I read a book of humorous quotations. I used to read quote books to find people to look into back before the internet, and it was easy to look them up. I had to go to the library, and they had his books, but first they had a two long playing record set of An Evening with Quentin Crisp, a version of which you can find on YouTube. Well, the sound isn't very good. But thank you, Deborah Rose, for that, and for loving me, and for letting me love you. And I hope you are smiling as I record this, and as everyone who will play this, if they will, plays it. Thank you for listening, and like and subscribe and donate and rate and review. Bye.